June 5, 1944, the English Channel. Wind howled across the deck of HMS Bololo. The command ship anchored among hundreds of vessels rocking in the storm. Sheets of cold rain hammered steel hulls and canvas tarps, while lightning briefly revealed the vast, restless armada that stretched to the horizon, an invasion force unlike anything the world had ever seen. Major General Percy Hobart, standing near the railing, squinted into the darkness. Somewhere out there, beyond the angry sea, lay the beaches of Normandy and the uncertain dawn of Operation Overlord. But tonight, it seemed the weather itself had turned against them. 20-foot waves, sir, reported a young Royal Navy officer, voice barely rising above the wind. Some of the landing craft are taking on water. If this keeps up. Hobart's eyes narrowed. We can't wait another week. Every delay costs us the element of surprise. Behind him, in the dimly lit operations room, men hunched over charts, plotting tides, wind speeds, and landing schedules. Eisenhower's meteorologists had given a small window, just one day when the seas might calm enough to launch. If they missed it, they might wait another month. And by then, Hitler's Atlantic wall would only grow stronger. But even if they reached France, another storm awaited, not of weather, but of logistics. Because the Allies had a secret problem no one wanted to face: how to keep an army alive once it landed. Every man in that room knew the lesson of history. Armies that outtrimmed their supplies died where they stood. And for all the courage of the men ready to storm the beaches, it was the endless hunger of war, for food, fuel, and ammunition, that would decide the fate of Europe. The ports along the French coast were the key, but they were also death traps. The Germans had fortified every harbor with mines, artillery, and concrete bunkers. If the Allies couldn't capture one intact, their entire invasion could grind to a halt within days. So, in the months leading up to D-Day, a small, secret group of British and American engineers had been working on a solution so audacious. It sounded like madness. If they couldn't capture a port, they would build one. Not on land. Not in weeks. But from the sea itself. The idea had begun years earlier. Whispered in the corridors of Whitehall. Winston Churchill, who had once served as First Lord of the Admiralty, was obsessed with military innovation. In 1942, he scribbled a note titled "Piers for Use on Beaches" and sent it to his staff with a single line. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. What followed was one of the most daring engineering feats in human history, a project so vast it rivaled the pyramids in scale and secrecy. It was called Mulberry. Across the quiet docks of southern England, thousands of labourers worked day and night under armed guard. They poured thousands of tons of concrete into massive moulds, creating hollow caissons, some the size of apartment buildings. Steel frames were welded into sections longer than football fields, designed to float, then sink on command. Each piece was part of a colossal puzzle that would only make sense when assembled off the coast of France. No one outside the project understood what they were building. Temporary breakwaters, they were told, just prototypes. But the truth was far more extraordinary. These floating fortresses would form artificial harbors, complete with roadways, piers, and unloading docks, where ships could offload men and material as if they were docking in London itself. By late May 1944, two entire Mulberry Harbors, one British, one American, lay hidden along the southern English coast. They were codenamed Mulberry A and Mulberry B, destined for Omaha Beach and Gold Beach respectively. Each harbor would require more than 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadways, and hundreds of sunken ships to serve as breakwaters. The logistical plan was staggering, even by wartime standards. Still, there was no guarantee it would work. The whole bloody thing might sink, muttered one engineer at Portsmouth, watching the tide lap against a newly built caisson, or worse, drift off to Germany. But there was no time for doubt. The invasion was coming. And somewhere beneath the storm clouds of the Channel, hundreds of young engineers were about to prove that steel, concrete, and human will could rewrite the laws of war. June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m., Omaha Beach, Normandy. The sea was chaos. Smoke rolled across the waves, veiling the sun in a sickly orange haze. Landing craft pitched violently as they slammed into the shallows, their steel ramps dropping into surf choked with bodies, debris, and the acrid smell of cordite. For the young engineers of the 1st Naval Construction Battalion, the Seabees, this was not what they had trained for. They were builders, not infantrymen, yet here they were, crouched behind the twisted wreckage of a half-sunk Higgins boat, bullets snapping overhead like angry hornets. Petty Officer Jack Myers ducked as a mortar burst nearby, spraying wet sand over his helmet. "Christ almighty," he muttered, "how the hell are we supposed to build anything in this?" Beside him, Lieutenant John Becker checked his watch. Then the distant horizon. "We build it because we have to," he said grimly, "or every man on this beach dies waiting for supplies that never come." Behind them, the coastline burned. Ahead, far beyond the surf and smoke, waited the heart of Operation Mulberry, a convoy of hundreds of ships, each carrying pieces of the greatest engineering gamble of the war. 3 days earlier, as the invasion fleet assembled off Portsmouth, those same ships had lain hidden among the invasion armada, disguised as ordinary transports. Few aboard the fleet knew their true purpose. Beneath tarpaulins and steel sheeting lay vast concrete caissons, pontoon roadways, and steel bridges that could unfold like the bones of some mechanical giant. The British called them phoenixes, whales, and spuds, each name masking a brilliant piece of engineering. Phoenix caisson, massive hollow blocks of reinforced concrete, each weighing up to 6.000 tons, designed to be towed across the channel and sunk to form a breakwater. Whales, floating roadways, flexible yet strong, that could ride the tide while connecting ships to shore. Spuds, towering steel piers that could adjust to the rise and fall of the sea, allowing trucks to drive directly from ship decks onto the beach. Together, these strange, almost science fiction structures would form a harbor large enough to service an entire army. By the morning of June 7, the first components began arriving off the Normandy coast. The seas were still rough, the kind of rough that made towing 6.000-ton concrete blocks a nightmare. Many had been lashed together and pulled by tugboats for more than 36 hours straight, bobbing dangerously in the storm-tossed channel. Captain George Slattery of the Royal Engineers watched as one of the Phoenix caissons drifted too close to another. "Ease her port line, he shouted through a loud hailer, but the wind drowned his voice. The two giants collided with a groan that echoed across the water, chunks of concrete spraying into the air. "Bloody hell," his adjutant muttered, "at this rate, we'll have no harbor left to build." Slattery only shook his head. "We'll build it from the pieces if we have to." And that's exactly what they did. Day and night, the engineers worked, waist-deep in cold surf, cutting cables, anchoring caisson, welding roadways under fire. Enemy aircraft screamed overhead, strafing the beaches. The roar of artillery never stopped. Yet, against all odds, the Mulberry Harbors began to take shape. At Gold Beach, where the British had landed, the first line of sunken ships, known as gooseberries, formed a protective arc against the waves. Behind them, the massive Phoenix blocks were flooded and sunk into position, forming a breakwater that stretched nearly 2 miles. At Omaha Beach, the Americans fought not only the enemy but the elements. The surf was rougher, the sand softer, and the tide more treacherous. Still, they pressed on, assembling their floating roadways piece by piece, linking ships to the shore. To any soldier watching from the beach, it must have looked like something out of a dream, or madness. From the grey water rose a city of steel and concrete, complete with floating docks, causeways, and cranes. Trucks rolled across the sea as if driving on air. Ships unloaded their cargo directly onto the new artificial piers. By June 18, the Mulberries were operational. And then, disaster struck. A sudden gale blew in from the Atlantic, one of the worst storms to hit the Channel in 40 years. For 3 relentless days, hurricane-force winds and 20-foot waves battered the Normandy coast. Men clung to steel girders as waves ripped apart the floating causeways. Phoenix caisson cracked and split under the pounding surf. Entire jetties were torn from their anchors and hurled onto the beach like toys. Lieutenant Becker, now commanding what was left of his engineering team at Omaha, watched helplessly as their months of labor vanished before his eyes. "Hold the lines," he yelled, voice drowned by the storm. "God damn it, hold them!" But nature would not be held. When the skies finally cleared, the sea was littered with wreckage. Mulberry, the American harbor, was gone, completely destroyed. Of its 115 caissons, only a handful remained intact. The British harbor at Gold Beach, however, had fared better, sheltered by geography and stronger anchoring. Mulberry, soon nicknamed Port Winston, survived. And that single harbor would go on to feed an entire army. In the weeks that followed, Port Winston became the lifeline of the Allied advance. From its floating piers, Liberty ships unloaded thousands of tons of supplies each day: ammunition, fuel, vehicles, food, even entire tanks. Between D-Day and the capture of Cherbourg, the harbor offloaded over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of cargo. One officer wrote home, "It is not a port built upon land, but upon courage." It floats, it groans, it bends, but it does not fail. And with every crate, every jeep, every tank that rolled ashore, the dream that began as Churchill's scribbled note became the beating heart of the Allied victory in Europe. June 23, 1944, off Gold Beach, Normandy. The fog lifted slowly that morning, revealing a sight no one on the Normandy coast would ever forget. Stretching nearly 2 miles out to sea, an entire harbour, made not of earth, but of steel and concrete, floated in the gentle swell. Liberty ships, Victory freighters, and landing craft moved in and out like clockwork, guided by buoys and barrage balloons that swayed against the dawn sky. To the untrained eye, it looked like a permanent city had risen from the sea overnight. To those who built it, it was a miracle still holding its breath. Major John Hughes of the Royal Engineers stood on the deck of a pontoon roadway, the metal grating clanging beneath his boots as a convoy of trucks rumbled past. "Can you believe it?" he said, shaking his head. "We're standing on something that didn't even exist 2 weeks ago." Sergeant Tom Dyer, covered in oil and salt spray, gave a wry grin. "Aye, sir, and she's feeding half the bloody army." They both turned as a fully loaded Liberty ship, SS Empire Battleaxe, eased into position at the floating pier. Her crew tossed lines to the dock hands. Cranes swung into motion, and within minutes, cargo nets began dropping crates, fuel drums, and vehicle parts onto the waiting lorries. In the chaos of D-Day's aftermath, Port Winston had become the most important piece of real estate in all of France, even though it floated. By late June, the harbour operated like a living organism. The Phoenix caisson formed a breakwater that stilled the worst of the Channel waves. Within its calm waters, ships of every size docked, unloaded, and departed in an unending cycle. Engineers had anchored more than 30 whale roadways, each spanning hundreds of feet, linking the floating piers, the spuds, to the beachhead. The spuds themselves were mechanical marvels, massive steel platforms with adjustable legs that could rise and fall with the tide, keeping the deck level even as the sea shifted beneath it. Every tide brought new challenges. Sometimes the cables snapped, or the floating roadways buckled under the weight of loaded trucks. When that happened, repair crews dove into the cold, oil-streaked water without hesitation, welding plates or replacing pontoons by hand, often while German artillery thundered in the distance. They had no illusions about their importance. One broken link in this chain could mean disaster for the soldiers fighting miles inland. The harbour was not just a marvel of engineering, it was a machine of survival. Supplies poured through Port Winston in staggering quantities. Each day saw over 7,000 tons of material offloaded, enough to sustain 3 full divisions. Ammunition crates stacked like walls, fuel drums rolled in endless lines, and food supplies stretched from one end of the beach to the other. The men of the Royal Army Service Corps joked that if you stood still long enough, someone would try to stack you on a truck. From the moment a ship arrived, the rhythm never stopped. Cranes swung like clock pendulums. Nets of cargo lifted into waiting trucks, and convoys roared inland along makeshift roads, bound for Caen, Bayeux, and beyond. The sound of progress never ceased. The clang of steel on steel, the growl of engines, the hiss of steam cranes, the endless bark of orders shouted through the wind. Even Eisenhower himself visited the harbour in July, standing on a pier as Liberty ships loomed above him like skyscrapers. He watched the operation unfold with quiet awe. "This," he said softly to his aide, "is the bridge to victory." The enemy knew it too. From the moment Mulberry B became operational, German reconnaissance aircraft circled high above, photographing the strange lattice of pontoons and caisson. Within days, Luftwaffe bombers began making nightly runs. Searchlights clawed at the darkness, and anti-aircraft guns on the breakwaters barked fire into the night sky. Tracers arced like comets, reflections dancing across the waves. On one such night, a Ju-88 bomber dove low over the harbour, releasing its payload before being shredded by flak. The bomb splashed down perilously close to a fuel barge, the explosion sending a column of fire skyward. Engines roared as tugboats raced to pull flaming debris away from the main structure. Miraculously, the damage was contained. Major Hughes later wrote in his logbook, "It feels strange to fight for a harbour that isn't on land. But make no mistake, every plank, every bolt here is worth more than gold." Inland, the Allied advance depended entirely on this floating port. The Battle of Caen was underway, and Patton's Third Army was preparing for the breakout at St. Lo. Every shell, every gallon of petrol that fueled their tanks, had touched Port Winston first. It wasn't glamorous work. The men who ran the harbour often laboured 16 hours a day in salt spray and mud. their uniforms stiff with grime. They ate cold rations, slept in tents on the beach, and patched their gear with whatever they could salvage. But they knew what was at stake. If the flow of supplies stopped, even for a day, the front would grind to a halt. And they couldn't let that happen. By late August, the Allies finally captured Cherbourg, a deep-water port that could handle full-scale logistics. Yet even then, Port Winston remained vital. Cherbourg had been so thoroughly sabotaged by the retreating Germans that it took months to repair. So the floating port continued to hum, day after day, night after night, feeding the liberation of Europe. When General Montgomery inspected the harbour again in September, he watched as another Liberty ship unloaded a cargo of Sherman tanks. "Never thought I'd see the day," he remarked, smiling faintly, "a port that floats, and it bloody works." By the time Port Winston was finally decommissioned in the winter of 1944, it had handled over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. The harbour had outlasted storms, bombs, and tides, and though its steel and concrete were eventually broken and sunk, its legacy endured. Because the war in Europe, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the gates of Berlin, had been fueled not just by bravery and strategy, but by engineering. And at its heart stood a port built from nothing, the Mulberry Harbor, proof that imagination and industry could win wars as surely as any weapon. October 1944, Arromanches-les-Bains. The beach was quiet now. The tides lapped gently against the rusted remains of the Phoenix caisson, half buried in sand and time. A group of local children climbed one of the great concrete hulks, laughing as they jumped into shallow pools left by the receding tide. An old British sergeant, visiting on leave, watched them from the seawall. He smiled faintly, his hand resting on the worn badge of the Royal Engineers pinned to his chest. "You'd never believe it," he murmured, "but once upon a time, that thing fed an army." And as the sun set over the channel, the waves whispered against the silent giants of steel and stone, the ghosts of the harbour that had changed the course of history.